Hello my friends, welcome to my channel, Lindy's Magpie Reads. If you're new here, I'm Lindy. I read a lot. What does that mean, reading a lot? I'm going to be touching on that subject in just a minute. But first I want to tell you about some other things going on in my life, not book related, including some fun I've been having in the kitchen. It is spring, so it is asparagus season. We get our asparagus from a local farm, Edgar Farms, that has such great, flavorful asparagus. The season is short and I just enjoy it while it's fresh. I also tried out the first recipe in this book, You Are Human and You Need Cake, which is such a great title. The first recipe is cinnamon streusel coffee cake. It was very yummy. The lilacs are blooming, so I made some lilac water. It's really simple. Just put a bunch of lilac flowers in water and let it sit in the fridge for a while, and the water gets this lovely fragrance. Great way to enjoy lilacs. I have made lilac jelly in the past, but I find that the flavor of cooked sugar almost overwhelms the lilac essence, so it's too much trouble for what you get. I do like dandelion jelly, however, but I've still got a jar of cramaillotte. That's the French name for dandelion jelly. I've still got a jar left from last year. So this year I made dandelion syrup. And for the sugar, I had some leftover spruce tip sugar from last year, where what was left in the jar had gotten kind of clumped together and hard, and that's what I used to make the dandelion syrup. So it's actually a combination dandelion spruce syrup, and I'm using it to sweeten lemonade and yogurt, and nice way to enjoy flavors of my garden. Oh yeah, and I made a batch of kimchi too. I also attended an online author event on Wednesday night. It's Casey Plett and Hazel Plante. The moderator was Candy Tanaka. It was jointly hosted by the Vancouver Public Library and the Vancouver Writers Fest, and you can watch it online on YouTube, so I will link it below. Casey Plett was talking about her first collection of short stories, A Safe Girl to Love, which has been reissued, and Hazel Plante was talking about her new novel, Any Other City, which I have just started reading, loving it. She was asked about her writing process, and she said, I don't really write in plots. This book was started with 2 Post-it notes. Hazel Plante also hosted a podcast with a whole bunch of episodes. She's finished that project now, but in this podcast she interviewed trans writers about their writing. And I've only listened to a couple of episodes so far, but it's fabulous. If you are wanting to read more trans authors like Casey Plett and Hazel Plante, check it out because she's got some great women on there. Now, let's get back to what I said at the beginning about reading a lot. So, for me, that means reading about a book a day. And I think how much a person reads or doesn't read is very personal. I've been quite sensitive about it in the past because sometimes I feel sort of freakish about how much I read, how many hours I spend reading a day. I was very interested in Kim's rant. Kim of Middle of the Book March, and she had read an online blog post and then did a great rant video about how much should you read in a day. I'm going to link her video below. Go and check it out if you haven't already. Yeah, for me, when I start having dreams that I'm at the bottom of a well surrounded by books, 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 and more books, that's a sign that I'm reading too much. But like I said, it's so personal. For our mental health, moderation is a good thing, but moderation for me might be just reading for 2 or 3 hours instead of 6 hours. For somebody else, it's entirely different. So now I'm going to talk about the books that I finished in the past week. There are 8 of them, including a book that I picked up for Misery May, a Thomas Hardy readathon that's hosted by Scott of Gunpowder Fiction and Plot and Gemma of Gemma Books. I will link their channels down below. And the book that I read is The Return of the Native. And in this book, there is a character who reads so much that he goes blind. So let that be a warning to me. So this story is set on a heath in the 1800s in England, and the plot is totally bananas. 3 guys, 2 women, and they're all interested in the person who's not interested in them. Lots of, oh, woe is me, eye-rolling kind of stuff, but I found it quite entertaining. There are a couple of passages that I want to read out loud because one applies to Springathon, a readathon that was for the first 2 weeks of May, hosted by Heidi of My Reading Life, Doris of Aldi Books, and Natalie of Curious Reader. So, nature writing via Thomas Hardy. His familiars were creeping and winged things, and they seemed to enroll him in their band. Bees hummed around his ears with an intimate air, and tugged at the heath and furze flowers at his side in such numbers as to weigh them down to the sod. The strange amber-colored butterflies which Egdon produced, and which were never seen elsewhere, quivered in the breath of his lips, alighted upon his bowed back, and sported with the glittering point of his hook as he flourished it up and down. Tribes of emerald green grasshoppers leaped over his feet, falling awkwardly on their backs, heads, or hips, like unskillful acrobats, as chance might rule, or engaged themselves in noisy flirtations under the fern fronds with silent ones of homely hue. Huge flies, ignorant of larders and wire netting, and quite in a savage state, buzzed about him without knowing that he was a man. So one of the central characters in this novel is a woman named Eustacia, and the other is a woman named Thomasin, and both of them are orphans. But Thomasin is a humble woman who comes from the Heath area, and Eustacia has airs and ideas about what is socially acceptable and what isn't, and that really constricts her ability to enjoy living where she is on the heath. And I kind of felt sorry for her, and I kind of hated her at the same time. So, in honor of Mental Health May, which is a readathon hosted by Kim of Middle of the Book March and Marilyn Maya Mendoza, I'm going to read from a chapter called She Goes Out to battle against depression. To Eustacia, the situation seemed such a mockery of her hopes that death appeared the only door of relief if the satire of heaven should go much further. Suddenly she aroused herself and exclaimed, "But I'll shake it off. Yes, I will shake it off. No one shall know my suffering. I'll be bitterly merry and ironically gay, and I'll laugh in derision, and I'll begin by going to this dance on the green." But can she shake it off? You need to read the story to find out. I'm glad I read it. I think it'll be at least a year before I'm ready for the misery of another Thomas Hardy novel, though. The next book I'm going to tell you about is about real misery. This is a history book that I picked up because of Tschann the Book Maniac talking about it on his channel. It's called Clearing the Plains: Disease, Politics of Starvation, and the Loss of Aboriginal Life. It's by James Daschuk, and I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Jade Nicholson. Now, I had 2 chapters left in the audiobook, which is 21 hours long, and my loan expired. And so then I got out a print edition from the library. But this is actually the original edition, and it was published 10 years ago. The new edition that I listened to is from 2022. The new edition has a foreword by Elizabeth Fenn, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and also an opening by Egan Wewidam James Sinclair. This book is about disease and starvation. The author started with the current situation in Canada, which is that Indigenous people have a much lower life expectancy than other Canadians, and that there's such a wide gap between the health of Indigenous peoples in Canada and other Canadians. So to find out why this is, he ended up going all the way back to original colonization and how diseases brought by the Europeans killed so many of the Indigenous peoples. But then after that, and particularly in the prairies where bison was the main food for many of the peoples living in that area, he says studies of skeletons have shown that in the mid-19th century, peoples on the plains were perhaps the tallest and best nourished population in the world. But by the early 1880s, the nutritional advantage provided by the herds would be gone for good. So there are multiple factors, including the killing of the bison by Europeans, and by removing the bison from the prairies, it would make way for ranchers with cattle, that the cattle coming in brought diseases to the bison as well, including diseases that when you eat the meat, you are infected. Humans were infected, and that long periods of malnutrition and starvation made Indigenous populations more susceptible to illnesses like tuberculosis, and starvation was used as a way for the Canadian government to control the Indigenous population and move people away from areas where they wanted to construct the railway and move in white settlers, and so on. It's a really important history showing that history is not just in the past, but continues to have long-term effects of what's happening today. So I'm really glad that I read this book, difficult as it is emotionally. And now on to something much lighter, also about food, but this one is about etymology, word origin. It's called Romaine Wasn't Built in a Day, The Delightful History of Food Language. It's by Judith Tschann, and the audiobook is read by Alejandra Reynoso. It's only about 4 hours long, highly entertaining. Here's an excerpt. She says, "It's satisfying to read recipes. For those of us who are wowed and cowed by fancy concoctions, it's as fun to read the recipe as to make it. Reading the recipe means thinking about the promise of transformation, of ingredients becoming a dish, and of words becoming food. Recipe is the imperative form take of the Latin verb recipere, to receive or take. It was used in medieval and early modern times at the beginning of lists of ingredients for medical prescriptions. The word recipe was often abbreviated to an R with a line crossing through its right leg. In modern usage, this abbreviation is usually printed RX and has come to mean prescription." If you're a word nerd like me, I think this is a book that you would like. This next book that I've got to tell you about is also about culture, this time fashion. When Fashion Really Works is the title. It's by Marnie, Fogg, and it was published in 2013. I picked it up because booktuber Heather Gregg posted a short video of visiting an exhibition titled Knitwear from Chanel to Westwood. And in the descriptions of the items on exhibit there, I saw that Marnie Fogg was the person who wrote stuff. So I looked to see if there was anything at my library, and this is a book that I found written by her. I mentioned that I'm a word nerd. I learned lots of words about textiles in this book, like radzamir, which is a firm silk or rayon fabric, often with lengthwise ribs or a broken twill, and it used to be used for the cloth that women's mourning clothes were made out of. It was dyed black. I went down many other internet rabbit holes, like what's Duchess satin? How is it different from regular satin? And then when I found that out, I thought, well, how is that different from taffeta? She talks about clothing that you are very familiar with, blue jeans, and the origins of this garment, the bikini, the fishtail parka. And I learned from this book that separation in the back with the two strings, that was designed so that you could wrap those back pieces around each leg and tie it so that wind wouldn't come up the back of your parka. It was designed for the American Armed Forces in Korea in the 1950s. And one more garment that I want to tell you about. It was designed by Elsa Schiaparelli in 1937. There's a lobster on the front of the dress. It's inspired by Salvador Dali's use of the crustacean in his well-known artwork, Lobster Telephone, which he created in 1936. Schiaparelli asked the surrealist artist to paint a lobster on the center front of her white organza evening gown. thought to denote sexuality, and the vagina dentata, which is a folklore motif of a vagina with teeth. The lobster design is positioned directly between the wearer's legs, which is particularly suggestive. Indeed. Moving on, next I want to tell you about Jade is a Twisted Green by Tanya Turton, who is a Black lesbian author from Toronto, and that is where this novel is set. I got this advanced reading copy from the publisher almost a year ago. It was in July or August last year, and I read a little bit of it then and set it aside, and I finally picked it up again, prompted by a readathon, a year-long readathon that Jolene of Bookworm Adventure Girl has been doing, Read Across Canada. May is Ontario. Her prompt is actually to choose short stories, but you don't have to follow the prompts. For me, my goal with Read Across Canada is to read the books on my shelves, so finding this one that's so clearly set in Ontario is perfect. And going back to fashion, I discovered that Tanya Turton seems to be totally obsessed with color blocking. If you don't know, color blocking in fashion means to use 2 or 3 colors to create a really striking statement. And I kept coming across references to color blocking in her work. Examples. He's wearing a cropped black lace color-blocked jacket and windbreaker shorts to match. Imani entered with her usual flair, wearing a color-blocked dress. Okay, but don't act like you not out here giving us color-blocking goodness, Jade said, praising her friend in return. Come through, Purple. Come through, Teal. When she arrived at the hotel in Miami, the colors shocked her. The walls were painted blue and orange, and color-blocked with various shapes. Her shoes, a color-blocked heel with shades of champagne and maroon, a velvety texture, and a platform for good height. She was usually 5 foot flat, but today she was a smooth 5'5" and looked like a goddess. When I was looking into more information about color blocking, did I mention that I do a lot of internet dives? I learned that Stephen Burrows, who was an African-American fashion designer who's popular in the 60s and 70s, he's the one who popularized color blocking in fashion. Stephen Burrows is not one of the designers mentioned in Marnie Fogg's book, though. You'll see I have some passages marked. Because this is an advanced reading copy, I did get out one from the library so I could double check that those passages hadn't been changed in the final copy. The story is about a pair of twins, Jade and Rose. And when the story starts out, Jade is grieving the death of her twin, Rose. So this is a good choice for Mental Health May, as it turns out. Jade also has severe anxiety attacks that started shortly after her sister died. They were 17 at that point. Her sister died by suicide. And when most of this story takes place, Jade is about 24 years old. The chapters are told from close third person through different characters in the story, including some of the people. mostly women, but also a man that Jade has romantic relationships with. And it's a story about figuring out oneself and one's place in the world, and especially coming through grief. Jade's background is Jamaican, Canadian, and there is a fair bit of Jamaican patois in this book. The sections I'm going to read are particularly relevant to Mental Health May. In this passage, Jade is getting together with an old girlfriend from high school. "How have you been?" Tay smiled with a knowing smile. Jade usually hated the "how are you" pleasantries of life because she felt quite honestly that people expected her to lie. And through lying, they formed a sort of agreement of mutual non-interference. Her mind stalled. She reflected on the simplicity of the question and reflected deeply on a far too complicated response. No one wanted to hear, "I'm sad, depressed, and broke." The alternative wasn't much better. "I'm on top of the world, and life is good to me." Most people wanted the short, vague summary. Good, fine, can't complain. Jade had been living with some form of anxiety or depression since Rose passed, maybe even before that. She'd had an emotional breakdown once in class because a second-year sociology professor asked how she was doing. Tears had burst from her eyes, and she'd cried through the entire class and the whole way home on the subway, and she literally hadn't been able to stop until she was so exhausted she fell asleep at home. The crying had lasted hours, like a leaky faucet. I quite liked the characterization and the emphasis on women's friendships and coming into your own power and knowing yourself that we get in this novel. Tanya Turton's writing, this is not exactly to my taste, but I love the queerness of this and all the references to Black culture, many of which I had to look up on the internet. So I feel like I learned stuff, and yeah, glad I read it. Oh yeah, and then after, when I was thinking about this novel, those twins, Jade and Rose, their names made me think about a play that I saw earlier this year, a live theater performance called Trouble in Mind, which is written by an African-American playwright and author, Alice Childress. Was first produced in 1955, and the story is about Black people performing on stage, and one of the lines has something to do with how Black characters in these plays are always named after flowers or jewels. Jade and Rose. There we go. Next up, I have a work of graphic nonfiction, a memoir in manga format called X Gender. And it's by a non-binary Japanese manga artist named Asuka Miyazaki. It's translated by Kathryn Henzler. Again, this is a book that fits really well in Mental Health May because Miyazaki has obsessive compulsive disorder. This book is about figuring out where they fit in. They realize that they are attracted to women, but they don't want anybody touching them, and they don't particularly feel like a woman, but they're not a trans man either. So there's some interesting passages about that. And in the author's afterword, I love their last line, "May you live as your most authentic self." This is just volume 1, and I look forward to reading more of their story. Okay, 2 more books to tell you about. Varjak Paw by S.F. Said. This one I read in an ebook format. It is a middle grade fiction, first published in, I think, 2003. It is animal fantasy, an allegory about a family of Mesopotamian blue cats. Varjak is the youngest member of the family, and they're always indoors, kept in this house, and until a point where he needs to go outside and be very brave in order to save the family. So it's an adventure story. Varjak learns something called the Way, which is kind of like a martial arts, spiritualism kind of thing to combat evil that's happening. This book won a gold medal, the Smarties Prize when it was published, and then recently was on a list of the 100 best children's books of the 21st century, and the illustrations are by Dave McKean. I recommend it. 5 stars. And last up, this is probably the favorite of all these books that I've been telling you about today, and I think it's only available in audio format. It's called Wild and Precious, a celebration of Mary Oliver. It's by Sophia Bush with contributions from many other writers, and it includes poetry by Mary Oliver. Many of them she reads in her own voice, and these other people are talking about how the poetry of Mary Oliver has influenced them and shaped their outlook. They talk about the way that Mary Oliver's poetry is about gratitude and fostering an attitude of wonder, which is what I love about her poetry too. 2 of the people who are interviewed here are Samin Nosrat, who's a cookbook writer, and she and Carmen Maria Machado talk about the dog poetry and their dogs in a very emotional way. And yeah, I'm a huge fan of Mary Oliver. When I turned 50, my sweetie put together a book of photos, and the opening quote is by Mary Oliver. It's me as a baby. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? It's hard for me to pick a favorite poem by Mary Oliver. There's so many great ones. But in honor of Springathon and Mental Health May, I've chosen Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. You are human, and you belong here. Much love to all of you. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to end this with a little clip of the progress that I've made on the shawl that I'm knitting, and then maybe just a little bit from my garden, because the Solomon seal is currently blooming and looking beautiful. You beautiful people, have yourselves a great day. Bye for now. So I finished this brioche section that I was working on last week, I talked about in my Friday reads, and it's attached to this. The first section was garter stitch with this sharp turn with the increases here, and now I've just finished the eyelet section. I think it's going to spread out once it's blocked, and now I need to pick up stitches along this edge, and it's going to be a slip stitch pattern, making a point. And then there's one more section at the other end here where I'll pick up stitches and make another point. And then my shawl will be done. It's really fun to knit.